Chapter 6, Section 4, Winning Independence. As I go, you're more than welcome to pause the video, replay the video. I'm going to read right through this reading, more or less, but feel free to rewind, repeat any of it if you would like. So, why it matters. After the American victory at Saratoga, the British threat to New England had ended. The British next tried to win the war by invading and capturing the South. The attempt failed and the Americans won their independence. Section Focus Question. How did the Americans win the war and make peace? The fighting moved south. The British turned to the South late in 1778. Their aim was to capture some key cities, win over the local population, and then march north, acquiring one state after another. The British advanced. At first, the plan seemed to work. British soldiers moved north from Florida to Georgia. In December 1778, the British took the city of Savannah. Within a month, they controlled most of Georgia. Moving on to South Carolina, the British captured the main port, Charlestown, and then the rest of the state. The British commander, Lord Charles Cornwallis, then carried the war into North Carolina. It looked as if the British might be unstoppable. To slow the British advance, Americans used the guerrilla tactics. Guerrillas are fighters who work in small bands to make hit-and-run attacks. If you remember, this is where the colonists learned this from the Native Americans during the French and Indian War, the Native Americans and the French during the French and Indian War. In South Carolina, Francis Marion led his men silently through the swamps. They attacked without warning, then escaped. Marion's guerrilla attacks were so efficient, he won the nickname Swamp Fox. Other bands of guerrillas were also active. Elsewhere in the South, Loyalist bands roamed the back country. They plundered and burned Patriot farms, killing men and children. If a stop cannot be put to these massacres, wrote one Continental general, the country will be depopulated in a few months. Brighter days. Patriot fortunes began to improve. On October 1780, some 900 frontier fighters defeated a larger force of British troops and Loyalists atop Kings Mountain in South Carolina. In December 1780, General Nathaniel Greene took over command of the Continental Army in the South. Greene split his small army in two. He led 1,200 men into eastern South Carolina, leaving General Daniel Morgan with 800 men in the West. In January 1781, Morgan won a clear victory at the Battle of Cowpens. He put a small militia force in front, telling the men to fire 3 shots and then retreat. The British rushed forward, only to be met by charging cavalry and a line of skilled riflemen. American traitor. Still, the British seemed to have the upper hand in the South. In addition to Cornwallis's forces, the British had troops under the command of the American traitor Benedict Arnold. A traitor is a person who betrays his or her country or cause and helps the other side. Early in the war, Arnold had fought bravely for the Patriots, but Arnold felt Congress undervalued him. He plotted to turn West Point, a key fort on the Hudson River in New York, over to the British. When the plot was discovered in September 1780, Arnold escaped. He and his loyalist soldiers then staged a series of destructive raids in Virginia. Final battle. Weakened by battles like Cowpens, Cornwallis headed to Virginia. That gave Greene an excellent opportunity over a 5-month period. Patriot forces swept through the deep South. By late summer, only Charlestown and Savannah remained in British hands. Cornwallis then made a fateful mistake. He moved his main army to the Yorktown Peninsula, a tongue of Virginia land poking out into Chesapeake Bay. There he thought the British fleet could reinforce his position. But at the end of August, the French fleet arrived off Yorktown and chased off British ships. At the same time, Washington rushed towards Virginia with American and French troops. Cornwallis found himself in a trap. American and French soldiers barred escape by land, while the French fleet blocked escape by sea. After 3 weeks, Cornwallis had no option but to surrender. On October 19, 1781, the Americans and French lined up in 2 facing columns. The British marched glumly between the columns and tossed their weapons into a large pile on the ground. The victory at Yorktown was the last major battle of the war. Checkpoint. How are Cornwallis and his troops trapped at Yorktown? Making peace with Britain. The news from Yorktown caused shockwaves in Britain. Although the king wanted to keep fighting, Parliament voted in favor of peace. Peace talks began in Paris in 1782. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Britain was eager for peace, so the Americans got most of what they wanted. The Treaty of Paris. The talks led to an agreement, the Treaty of Paris. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The boundaries of the new nation were set at the Atlantic on the east, Canada on the north, and the Mississippi River on the west, and Florida on the south. Florida itself was returned to Spain. For its part, the United States agreed to earnestly recommend that the states restore rights and property taken from Loyalists during the war. However, most states ignored this pledge. On April 15, 1783, Congress approved the treaty. The war was officially over. It had been almost exactly 8 years since the shot heard around the world started fighting at Lexington. And here's a map there of what happened. And as you can see here, Yorktown is at the end of that little peninsula where he got trapped. We'll come back to this page in just a second. Washington's farewell. On December 4th, 1783, Washington and his ranking officers were reunited for one last meal together at Fraunces Tavern in New York City. In parting, each man in turn embraced Washington. One officer wrote, "Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I've never before witnessed." Washington wished to retire to his plantation. Soon, though, he would again be called to the aid of the nation he had helped create. Checkpoint question. What was the Treaty of Paris? Impact of the Revolution. The immediate effect of the American Revolution was to create a new nation of 13 independent states, linked by ties of custom and history. The long-term effects are still being felt today. The Declaration of Independence cemented ideas like equality and liberty in the American mind. Over time, those concepts have gained broader meanings. The impact of American independence reached beyond the borders of the infant nation. In 1789, French citizens rebelled. Leaders of the French Revolution, including Lafayette, looked to the American example. They issued the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, modeled in part on the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution also inspired later independence movements in Latin America. Checkpoint question. How did the American Revolution affect France? Looking back and ahead. The United States emerged from the American Revolution as a proud nation, but also a weak and deeply in debt nation. In the next chapter, you'll read how the new nation met the challenge of forming a democratic government. So, why did the Americans win the war? Many factors contributed to the American victory. They fell into four main groups: geographic advantages, help from abroad, patriotic spirit, and skilled leadership. Critical thinking, evaluate this information. What do you think was the most important reason for the American victory? So the first one here is geography. Americans, such as Francis Marion, pictured below, were on their home ground. They knew the forests, the hills, and swamps, but British forces were far from their home country. They had to depend on longer supply lines stretching across the Atlantic Ocean. Help from abroad. The Americans might have never won without the help from Europe. Men such as Lafayette, Wright, and von Steuben below, provided military leadership and support. Money from such countries as Spain and the Netherlands was also crucial. That's Lafayette and von Steuben down here. Skilled leadership. Despite great odds, George Washington never gave up. Although he faced criticism in Congress, his courage and knowledge won him broad support in the army. And though his troops suffered at Valley Forge, Washington led them through the hardship to victory. And the last one, patriotic spirit. The key asset of the Americans was patriotism. Americans were fighting to create a new nation. Many soldiers stayed in the armies for years at great financial and personal sacrifice. Leaders such as Jefferson and Adams risked their lives and fortunes to champion independence. And those are the 4 big reasons why Americans won the war. If you need to replay, review any of this, please do that. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.